Somewhere in the middle of the Sahara Desert in early 1935, two British women were pushing a dead motorcycle through sand that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The engine had seized, a connecting rod bearing had failed, and their 600 cubic centimeter Panther was now nothing but 425 pounds of dead weight bolted to a sidecar and a trailer full of spare parts that, as it turned out, were not spare enough. They had no compass, no support vehicle, no radio, no real backup plan. The nearest replacement parts were sitting in a factory in Cleckheaton, Yorkshire, roughly 2,500 miles to the north. And the French Foreign Legion officers they had argued past at the last checkpoint had already told them this exact thing would happen. But Theresa, Wallach, and Florence Blenkiron did not push that motorcycle 25 miles to the nearest oasis because they were reckless. They pushed it because quitting had never been part of the conversation. Local tribesmen saw what was happening and brought horses to help drag the rig through the sand. Their plan was to ride a motorcycle from London, England, to Cape Town, South Africa, across the Sahara, through equatorial Africa, on a single-cylinder motorcycle with a sidecar, in 1934. And that is exactly what they did. But this story does not start in the desert. It starts in a garden in Buckinghamshire, with a teenage girl and a secret she was hiding from her parents. Theresa Wallach was born on the 30th of April, 1909, into a respectable English family. Her father was a stockbroker and gentleman farmer who also happened to be a serious explorer and collector with one of the most significant private archaeological and anthropological collections in the country. So the taste for adventure arguably ran in the family. Her father just never expected it to involve two wheels and a throttle, because young Theresa had discovered motorcycles. And once she did, nothing else mattered. She grew up near the factories producing the great British motorcycle marquees: Norton, BSA, Triumph, AJS. She became friends with test riders and engineers, learned to wrench from the people who built the bikes, and started riding herself as a teenager. Her parents were, to put it gently, not supportive. She reportedly hid her first motorcycle entirely. When she finally got tired of the secrecy, she parked it right in the family garden and braced for the fallout. Her competition trophies had to stay out of sight too, tucked away where guests would not see them, because in the 1930s in England, a woman who raced motorcycles was considered something between an oddity and a scandal. When she tried to join her local motorcycle club, they flat out refused her. Women were not welcome. Now here is where Wallach separates herself from the typical underdog origin story. She did not just ride motorcycles, she understood them at an engineering level. At age 18, she dismantled her first engine on her bedroom floor, spread the parts across the carpet, and put the whole thing back together. In 1928, she won a scholarship to study engineering at Northampton Polytechnic Institute in London, where she was the only woman in her entire year. She earned a certificate for mechanics and heat in 1931 and graduated in 1932. After that, she worked at British Thomson Houston and then at the Hercules Engineering Company. She became a member of the Women S Engineering Society. This was a woman who could calculate bore-to-stroke ratios before breakfast and diagnose a failed big-end bearing by sound alone. She was not just brave, she was an engineer. And that combination is exactly what would keep her alive when things went sideways in the Sahara. Around the same time, she joined the London Ladies Motor Club, which finally got her through the gates of Brooklands, the legendary racing circuit in Surrey, the spiritual home of British motorsport. And at Brooklands, she reportedly won the very first race she entered. But more importantly, Brooklands is where she met Florence Blenkiron, and that meeting changed everything. Florence Margaret Charlotte Blenkiron, known as Blenk by Wallach, was 5 years older and came from a completely different world. Born in Harnby, North Yorkshire in 1904, she grew up at Ellerton Abbey in the North Riding, the daughter of a man of private means. She later moved to Sheffield, where she worked as secretary to Sir Robert Hadfield, the owner of one of the largest steel foundries on the planet. She had genuine industrial experience and organizational skills that would prove critical later. Blenkiron had been riding motorcycles since she was 16. She was not casual about it. In 1928, she competed in the very first ladies' race held at Brooklands, organized by Lady Malcolm Campbell. By October 1933, she had won the 3-lap all-comers handicap, believed to be the first woman to win a race at Brooklands where men and women competed on equal terms. That alone would be enough for most people's highlight reel. Blenkiron was just getting started. On the 14th of April, 1934, riding a 500cc Grindley Peerless, Florence Blenkiron broke the 100 miles per hour barrier on a motorcycle at Brooklands. She recorded 102.06 miles per hour and earned the coveted BMCRC Gold Star for the achievement. She was the first woman ever to do it. So when Wallach and Blenkiron became friends, moved into a house together in South London, and started talking about motorcycles over the kitchen table, you had two of the most accomplished female motorcyclists in British history sitting across from each other. One of them had an idea. Blenkiron wanted to visit family friends in Cape Town, South Africa. Somewhere in a conversation that almost certainly started as a joke, someone asked, "What if we just rode there?" Most people would have laughed and moved on. These two spent over a year turning that joke into a mission. Getting sponsorship was a nightmare. Manufacturer after manufacturer turned them down. The so-called experts of the day were absolutely certain that you could not cross the Sahara on an air-cooled motorcycle. The idea of two women doing it alone was dismissed as fantasy. Eventually, Phelan and Moore of Cleckheaton, the makers of Panther motorcycles, stepped up and offered them a machine. They chose the Panther Model 100 Redwing. If you know anything about vintage British motorcycles, you know this was a very specific choice. The Panther was a 598cc overhead valve single-cylinder sloper that produced about 23 horsepower through a 4-speed Berman gearbox. The engine was so massive it literally formed the front-down tube of the frame. This was not a sports bike, this was a workhorse. It had been designed from the ground up specifically for hauling heavy sidecars through rough conditions, and it weighed 425 pounds dry before you even bolted on the sidecar. The bottom end was built like a bridge, multi-plate clutch running in oil, 8-inch front drum brake, 7-inch rear, ignition by BTH Magneto, which was built by Wallach's former employer, British Thomson Houston. It was slow, heavy, and about as glamorous as a tractor. It was also the perfect machine for what they were about to do. Watsonian Squire provided a sidecar and a small trailer that doubled as a tent when camp was made. The trailer carried spare parts, tools, fuel cans, water containers, and provisions. The trailer was critical to their plans. The whole rig was christened the Venture. Blenkiron spent months stress testing the outfit at events throughout 1934 before departure day. This was planned down to the last detail, except of course for all the parts they could not plan for, which turned out to be most of it. On the 11th of December 1934, Theresa Wallach and Florence Blenkiron rolled out of Crown House on the Aldwych in central London. Roughly 1,000 people showed up to see them off. Viscountess Nancy Astor was there, the first woman to sit as a member of Parliament, along with 5 other female members of Parliament and the High Commissioner for Southern Rhodesia. Astor gave a roaring send-off. She declared herself an unrepentant feminist and said that whatever a man could do, a woman could do too. She promised to follow their progress with pride and joy. Wallach, ever the pragmatist, told the assembled press that they could not afford to buy petrol and powder and cigarettes as well, so they just bought petrol. And with that, the Venture pulled away from the curb and headed south, into a world that looked nothing like the one we live in today. To understand what Wallach and Blenkiron were riding into, you have to picture 1934. Nazi Germany was rearming across the English Channel. Mussolini was about to invade Ethiopia. France controlled a massive colonial empire stretching across North and West Africa, and the French Foreign Legion patrolled the Saharan caravan routes with an iron grip. The routes south of the Mediterranean coast were often little more than tracks, packed dirt, rocks, sand, caravan paths. The first motorized vehicles had only crossed the Sahara in the early 1930s. One source notes that it was not until 1933 that a car had been used to reach many of these areas, and no documented motorcycle journey from London to Cape Town had ever been completed. What Wallach and Blenkiron proposed to do on a single-cylinder motorcycle had literally never been done. The first leg was relatively simple. Folkestone to Boulogne by ferry, then through France in the December cold, through Paris and south to Marseille, where a rough 36-hour sea crossing dropped them in Algiers, the capital of French Algeria. That is where the real adventure began. They needed permits from the French colonial authorities to cross the Sahara. The colonial office in Algiers took one look at two British women on a motorcycle and sidecar and said, absolutely not. The desert would kill them, and France did not want the diplomatic headache of two dead English women in the sand. But Wallach and Blenkiron had spent over a year preparing for this. They had letters of support, engineering credentials, and a level of stubbornness that the colonial bureaucracy was simply not prepared for. They got their permits. This pattern repeated itself for the entire journey south. The French Foreign Legion controlled the desert caravan routes, and they were not enthusiastic about two unescorted British women heading into one of the most hostile environments on the planet. At checkpoint after checkpoint, Legion officers tried to stop them, warned them they would die, questioned their sanity, and flat out ordered them to turn back. Wallach and Blenkiron argued their case every single time, presented their credentials, explained their preparation, refused to leave, and they won every single time. These were two women who had raced at Brooklands, rebuilt engines with their own hands, and broken speed records. They were not going to be turned around by a man behind a desk, telling them they could not handle it. On the 26th of December, 1934, Boxing Day, they turned south from the Atlas Mountains and entered the Sahara proper. Their route ran through Gardaya, In Salah, Tamanrasset, In Guezam, and on toward Agadez, roughly 1,800 miles of open desert. And by all accounts, they carried no compass. Let that register for a second. They navigated the Sahara Desert largely by asking directions at each oasis and pointing the motorcycle toward the next one. In 2025, most of us have a meltdown when our phone loses GPS signal for 30 seconds. These two women aimed a motorcycle at the horizon and hoped for the best. The crossing took about a month, and it was punishing from the very first mile. Blenkiron described the desert surface as being like an enormous plowed field. Rocky, rutted, and relentless. Punctures were constant. Soft sand meant getting off and pushing. Temperatures could be scorching during the day and freezing at night. Just 300 miles into the desert, a sidecar mounting bracket sheared clean off. Wallach spent 5 straight hours repairing it in the sand, with basic hand tools and no workshop. Then the trailer tow hitch broke, and she fabricated a replacement from scratch in the middle of the Sahara. That engineering degree was no longer a line on a resume. It was the reason they were not dead. But the desert was not finished with them. Sand and dust likely contributed to the engine's failure. The big end bearing gave out, the connecting rod failed, and the motor seized solid. They were stuck in the Sahara with a dead motorcycle and no way to fix it. What happened next took 6 weeks. Replacement parts had to be ordered from the Phelan and Moore factory in Yorkshire, shipped across the Mediterranean, and transported overland through the desert to an oasis where 2 English women were sitting and waiting and refusing to give up. 6 weeks of watching the sun rise and set over the same patch of sand, rationing their supplies, staying in an oasis settlement, maintaining whatever they could on the motorcycle, and just waiting for a connecting rod and a set of bearings to travel 2,500 miles from a factory in northern England to the middle of the Sahara Desert. The postal system of colonial Africa in the 1930s was not exactly Amazon Prime. Most expeditions would have called it there. Found passage home, written it off as a valiant attempt that went further than anyone expected. Wallach and Blenkiron stayed put. They had told London they were riding to Cape Town, and Cape Town was where they were going. And the desert still was not done. At some point during the crossing, they were detained by Tuareg nomads. The details are frustratingly unclear. The Women's Engineering Society Journal reported that their more unpleasant adventures included 4 nights in a tropical jungle without food or shelter, and capture by the Tuareg in the desert. Exactly what happened remains unclear. But whatever it was, they made it through. When the parts finally arrived, they moved on to Agadez, in what is now Niger. Wallach rebuilt the entire engine from scratch. Then they continued south. If you are finding this story as wild as I think you are, hit subscribe. I cover forgotten stories like this regularly, and most of them will blow your mind just as hard. Now, crossing the Sahara would have been enough for most people. For Wallach and Blenkiron, it was roughly the halfway point. From Agadez, they pushed into Nigeria. According to the National Motor Museum, they are widely credited as the first to reach Nigeria via the Sahara by motorcycle. They hit Katsina by mid-March and then Kano. But near Lake Chad, the front wheel collapsed completely. It took 5 days to find a repair shop capable of rebuilding it, and even then, the fix was not clean. The rebuilt wheel was out of true, which meant the front brake was essentially useless from that point on. Think about what that means in practical terms. You are riding a motorcycle loaded with a sidecar and all your worldly possessions through terrain that has no guardrails, no hospitals, and no breakdown service. And your front brake does not work for thousands of miles. So now they are riding through equatorial Africa with one working brake. They push through French equatorial Africa, past Fort Archambault in what is now Chad, past Mount Ruwenzori, and into the lush grasslands of Uganda. Here, a new enemy emerged: tiny grass seeds. The seeds were so fine they got sucked into the engine's cooling fins and intake, clogging everything. The engine overheated, and the Panther needed yet another full rebuild. This time, they did it on a tea plantation in Uganda. By this point in the journey, Wallach later wrote that the entire machine was now held together by nuts and bolts, taken from wherever they could be spared. In addition to wire, string, and rubber bands cut from used inner tubes, they used their initiative. Chewing gum was used to seal leaks in the fuel tank and the water container. Chewing gum, sealing a fuel tank, on a motorcycle crossing Africa in 1935. From Uganda, they pressed on through Kampala, then Nairobi in Kenya, past the snow-capped peak of Mount Kilimanjaro, to Arusha, and south through the territory of Tanganyika, which today is Tanzania. Somewhere in Tanganyika, they had a collision with one of the only cars they had seen in days. Apparently, the universe wanted to make absolutely sure this journey tested every possible scenario. From Tanganyika, they continued south, and for the first time in months, something beautiful happened. They reached Victoria Falls, the massive curtain of water on the Zambezi River between modern Zambia and Zimbabwe. After thousands of miles of sand, rocks, grassland, and mechanical disasters, they were finally riding through territory that had real infrastructure, real roads, real towns. From Victoria Falls, they pushed through Beaulieu in southern Rhodesia, hit the South African frontier at Beitbridge by mid-July, passed through Pretoria, and pointed the Panther south one final time. The last 3,000 miles of the journey were, by comparison to everything before, almost civilized. Almost. On Monday, the 29th of July, 1935, Theresa Wallach and Florence Blenkiron rode into Cape Town. Take a breath and think about what that sentence actually means. 2 women left London on a motorcycle 8 months earlier. They crossed the English Channel, drove through France, sailed to North Africa, argued their way past French Foreign Legion checkpoints, crossed the Sahara Desert with no reliable navigation, pushed a dead motorcycle through sand for miles, waited 6 weeks for engine parts, were detained by Tuareg nomads, rebuilt the engine from scratch twice, lost their front brake at Lake Chad, sealed the fuel tank with chewing gum, crashed into one of the only cars on the road, and covered what most sources estimate at roughly 13,000 miles through terrain that most of the world's best explorers would not have attempted in a car. And they arrived on the same motorcycle they left with. They had just become the first motorcyclists, male or female, to ride from London to Cape Town. They are believed to be the first to cross the Sahara Desert on a motorcycle combination, and they are widely regarded as the first to complete the length of Africa by motorcycle. And here's the part that should genuinely frustrate you. When the British motorcycling press wrote about the events of 1935, they focused on the International 6 Days trial held in the Bavarian Alps. This journey, This absolutely absurd feat of engineering, endurance, and sheer willpower got almost no coverage in the specialist technical press. As one historian later observed, the remarkable achievement was largely ignored by the publications that should have celebrated it the loudest. Wallach returned to England sick with fever and flat broke. She reportedly slept rough on the streets of London in the immediate aftermath. By 1938, she was desperate enough to place an anonymous classified advertisement that read, "Timbuktu or anywhere. Young lady holding world motor records wants job. Denim, bucks." A woman who crossed the Sahara on a motorcycle looking for work through a newspaper ad. The world didn't care. But Blenkiron wasn't finished riding. After Wallach sailed home ill, Phelan and Moore shipped a replacement motorcycle, the Venture II, to Cape Town by sea. She was not finished. In September 1935, just weeks after arriving, Blenkiron set off to ride home, alone, without the trailer this time, solo, on a replacement motorcycle she had not tested, back the way they came. She retraced the route north through Salisbury, which today is Harare in Zimbabwe, through Nairobi, and on through the remote stations of Faraje and Nyangara. Broken valve springs, punctures, and a fractured sidecar chassis tube dogged her the whole way. Dogged is the right word. She made it all the way back to Kano in Nigeria before French authorities put their foot down. They told her she could not cross the Sahara alone. The cost of any potential rescue was deemed too high. So she accepted a ride on a vehicle called the Desert Bus, with the motorcycle loaded aboard for the 3-week Saharan transit. Then she rode the final stretch from Algiers to London by herself. She arrived on the 9th of April, 1936, nearly 16 months after she and Wallach had originally departed. At Rhodesia House in London, she met the High Commissioner and handed him a letter she had carried all the way from the Prime Minister of South Africa. Her motorcycle went on display in Selfridge's department store in central London. She gave lectures to the International Motorcyclist Touring Club. The press ran stories. And then, as so often happens with stories that deserve to be remembered, the world moved on to other things. But Wallach and Blenkiron did not stop moving. When World War II erupted, both women served with distinction. Blenkiron joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service and eventually transferred to the Mechanized Transport Corps. She shipped out to Kenya, then Egypt, and by 1941 she was commanding convoys of trucks and armored vehicles across Egypt, Palestine, and Syria. She trained drivers and mechanics at the Mina School of Military Driving outside Cairo. She was mentioned in dispatches in 1945. After the war, she moved to India, married an army officer named Kenneth Kingaby, farmed in Somerset, and lived quietly until her death on the 4th of March, 1991. Most of her neighbors in Peterborough probably had no idea that the woman they knew as Margaret Kingaby had once broken 100 miles per hour at Brooklands and crossed the Sahara on a motorcycle. Wallach's post-war story might be even more remarkable. But before the war even started, she had one more accomplishment to add. In the spring of 1939, she earned her own BMCRC Gold Star at Brooklands by lapping the track at over 100 miles per hour on a 350 cubic centimeter Norton. That's a small bike to be doing triple digits on. She became only the third woman in history to earn that distinction, after Blenkiron and the legendary Beatrice Schilling. This Gold Star marked her place in racing history. During the war, she served 7 years in the Women's Auxiliary Corps, reportedly becoming the first woman motorcycle dispatch rider in the British Army. In 1942, she became one of the first female ATS tank mechanics. After the war ended, she climbed on another motorcycle and set off on a 2.5-year, 32,000-mile solo journey across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, paying her way with odd jobs that ranged from airplane mechanic to dishwasher. She proved she was the first of a new kind of long-distance rider. She settled in Chicago in 1952. No shop would hire her at first, but word spread about her private garage work, and she eventually opened her own dealership importing British machines. Then she found the work that would define the rest of her life. Chicago was where she built her reputation as a teacher and mechanic. In 1959, 3 Chicago businessmen walked in to buy BSA motorcycles for a European tour. Wallach refused to sell them the bikes until she had personally taught them how to ride. When they came back from Europe in one piece and full of gratitude, she realized motorcycle education was her calling. In 1970, she published Easy Motorcycle Riding, which became a bestseller and put her on television. In 1973, she moved to Phoenix, Arizona, and founded the Easy Riding Academy. She believed the only effective teaching ratio was 1-to-1, and she stuck to it. Easy riding became her mission. Wallach was a founding member and first vice president of the Women's International Motorcycle Association. She never owned a car in her entire life. She kept riding until she was 88 years old, when failing eyesight finally forced her to hand over her license. She remained true to a single lifelong habit. She would always ride. Theresa Wallach died on her 90th birthday, the 30th of April, 1999, in Phoenix, Arizona. She had ridden motorcycles on 6 continents, trained thousands of riders, survived a world war, and crossed a desert that experts said would kill her. And she did it all without ever buying a car. In 2003, 4 years after her death, she was inducted into the AMA Motorcycle Hall of Fame. The citation called the Africa expedition one of the most radical motorcycle journeys ever undertaken. Her book, The Rugged Road, was published in 2001 from the detailed diary she kept during the trip. A 32-minute silent film cut from her original 16mm expedition footage also survives and can be found on YouTube. Her induction into the Hall of Fame cemented the legacy of that journey. And in 2018, at an auction house in West Sussex, a box covered in Union Jack fabric turned up containing 66 previously unknown glass plate photographs from the journey. Images of the desert, the motorcycle, the oases, the people they met along the way, snapshots nobody knew existed from a trip most of the world had already forgotten. They sold for £1,300. 66 windows into a journey that deserved a monument but barely got a footnote. When people talk about the history of adventure motorcycling, the conversation usually starts with Ted Simon's Jupiter's Travels in the 1970s, or maybe Ewan McGregor and Charlie Borman's Long Way Round from the 2000s. Those are great stories. But the real origin of the genre happened decades earlier, on a Panther Model 100 held together with wire, rubber bands, and chewing gum, piloted by 2 women who could not even get accepted into a motorcycle club back home. The specialists who said it was impossible were wrong. The press that ignored it was wrong. And anyone who wrote off Wallach and Blenkiron because of their gender was wrong about everything. Theresa Wallach once said that when she first saw a motorcycle, she got a message from it. It was a feeling, the kind of thing that makes a person burst into tears, hearing a piece of music or standing awestruck in front of a fine work of art. Motorcycling, she said, is a tool with which you can accomplish something meaningful in your life. It is an art. She crossed a continent to prove it, and the world almost forgot she did. If you want to see another story about someone who did the impossible before anyone was paying attention, check out the video on screen right now. I'll see you there.